What kind of a man burns down his own village, poisons its wells, and worst, staves his own people just for the sole purpose of crushing the best of the best empires of his age? This is the story of Vlad the Impaler, who once ruled Wallachia. However, Vlad wasn't really a man of mercy, but rather, cruelty was his biggest weapon. And today, we're covering some of his most horrific punishments, brutalities that would one day inspire the legend of Count Dracula and his own fall. But beware, because these punishments aren't for everyone. Constantinople versus Wallachia, the start of brutality. Back in 1462, Constantinople was at its height, with Sultan Mehmed II being the conqueror of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed marched into Wallachia with an army of around 90,000, and his target was none other than Vlad III, the voivode of Wallachia. For people who don't know what a voivode is, it's basically a local governor or ruler in Central and Eastern Europe. So, when the Ottomans entered the land, to their surprise, they didn't find a single standing army. At first, they were confused and didn't know what to do. All the hearts were beating fast, and the only thing they could think of was that maybe Vlad got so scared that he left with his troops. However, Vlad had ordered an unthinkable tactic. This was a totally scorched earth. Fields were torched, granaries destroyed, livestock killed or mostly driven away, and even the wells were poisoned. Soon enough, the Ottomans realized that entire villages vanished overnight, and not because of any enemy, but this was the wish of Vlad III himself. Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus Vlad, in his own words, declared, "I have killed peasants, men, and women, old and young. We have burned everything. Now, I know what you're wondering. You must be thinking how stupid this guy is to self-sabotage his country, but according to Vlad, it was all strategy. Facing overwhelming Ottoman Empire numbers, he knew that he couldn't win an open battle. Instead, he turned the land into a weapon. Then, Sultan and his troops marched deep into a wasteland, but were stripped bare. Hunger was destroying them, and disease spread in the absence of clean water. Everyone's morale collapsed even before their swords ever clashed. However, this was just the beginning, because the real mess was just starting out. Heads of spikes. After Mehmed's troops reached Wallachia's fortresses, they expected to finally meet the armies, but instead, they faced forests of impaled bodies. When they reached the gates of Targovishte, they saw thousands of Ottoman prisoners, scouts, and even envoys mounted on wooden stakes. This was quite a horrific scene, and many people claim that the bodies hung there were more than 20,000 in a single panorama. This is where the Sultan sent his high-ranking messenger, but their fate was just as cruel as the people who died, thanks to Vlad. After refusing to remove their turbans before King Vlad due to religious reasons, he mocked them by saying, "Then let them be nailed to your heads in respect of your customs." Surely enough, after killing them, their turbans were hammered into their skulls, and their bodies also joined the gruesome display. Moving back to Sultan Mehmed, this guy was quite a hardened warrior. His troops were some of the toughest because they literally had Constantinople in their hands, but this grisly scene was enough to bring everyone's morale down. Venetian and Ottoman chronicles both admitted that their armies froze in terror. Even the man himself, Sultan Mehmed, a man who was used to watching blood and brutality, reportedly turned pale and angry after seeing his own kind murdered in cold blood. A lot of people have also reported that the Sultan was murmuring that you cannot defeat a man who does not fear God, his enemies, or even his own people. This time, psychological warfare was at an all-time high, and this was the darkest display of brutality by Vlad. But this was just the start of Sultan's punishment, because a lot more was right around the corner. Impalement. If there's one word that describes Vlad the best, it's impalement. I mean, what's the fun in not putting a spear through your enemies, right? While impalement wasn't invented by him, Vlad elevated it to a level where it became a form of punishment, a state policy, and an art. Here's how it worked. You would see a sharpened wooden stake that was driven through the body, often inserted in the lower torso, sometimes through the abdomen or butt. However, this was also carefully angled so that the stake would not hit vital organs and the victim would stay alive, crying in agony, for hours, days, and even weeks before finally choosing death as a far better option. The executioners would raise the stake upright, leaving the victim suspended like a banner. In Vlad's reign, entire groups were arranged where soldiers were on one side, while women and children were on the other side. This created a series of endless suffering where people could look at each other. The travelers who saw these punishments would call this the forests of the impaled. Then, in 1462, as Mehmed approached Vlad, he showed his most impressive and notorious display. This was 20,000 captives impaled in perfect formation outside the city. The scale on which these people were impaled shocked the Ottomans, and to walk past miles of screaming and rotting bodies wasn't easy. While it was not as physically taxing, the mental torture one must go through was insane. Vlad was playing with everyone's psychology here, and it was so picture-perfect for him. You might be wondering why Vlad would only punish his enemies or invaders with such severe punishment, right? No, even within Wallachia, he used it as his tool of law and order. Someone betrayed him, attacked his loved ones, or stole something. Well, he would put his soldiers to work and execute them. There is this very popular story where a woman lied about her husband's work. But this crime, according to Vlad, was so dangerous that he executed the woman to undermine the civic order. According to him, this was discipline, and lying was the worst. More torture. Mutilation. Not every prisoner was impaled, and surely you must be thinking that Vlad would finally show some mercy, right? Well, not really. Slavic people of that time describe Vlad mutilating the captured Ottoman soldiers before sending them back. But you know what's worse? The method they chose for this mess. Their noses, ears, and sometimes eyes were gouged out. And they took things to the next level by carving their skin with symbols, while others had their limbs destroyed so they could crawl, but not fight. There wasn't any mercy shown, but they were weapons of terror, meant to affect the Ottoman lines and spread panic among them. So far, we know that Vlad was not only a man of brutality, but he was also way too calm and composed. He knew that patience was a skill he needed to master in order to become the most fearsome ruler of his time. Imagine being a soldier waiting for reinforcement, only to see your comrades returning eyeless, humiliated, and permanently scarred. They didn't need to speak, because their bodies told the full picture. Sultan Mehmed also found it insulting to himself because Vlad wasn't just fighting with a sword or fire, but he was fighting like a guy who had zero empathy and respect for the enemy. Torture in Wallachia. On the contrary, Vlad's cruelty wasn't just limited to war, because within Wallachia, which is Romanian land today, he governed with fear as his main weapon. Chronicles describe how entire groups of thieves, beggars, or rebellious peasants were regularly rounded up and impaled as warnings. Normally, small theft and other crimes would be forgiven after the person had taken the punishment. But in Wallachia of that time, there was no display of mercy anymore. In one infamous story, Vlad invited hundreds of boyars, who are basically nobles, to a banquet. However, during the feast, he accused them of corruption and betrayal. Suddenly, his bipolarity made them drag him outside the castle and impale him on the spot. Others were forced into labor till they dropped dead. Another popular story was when a golden cup was placed at a public fountain in Targovishte. According to him, anyone could drink from the cup, but theft was punishable by death. This cup remained untouched for years. And to be honest, this was interesting because the crime rates were dropping. However, the biggest criminal was Romania's leader himself. Even minor offenses like laziness, dishonesty, and disobedience meant public torture, and Vlad believed that a society could only be ruled by terror. This terror would make them withstand foreign invasion and even internal issues. To make things worse, this strategy worked because it resisted both the Ottoman and the Hungarian domination during his time. This wasn't because of how rich he was or the number of troops, but due to his strategy and fear-mongering. Night attack. The legend of Vlad didn't stop at brutality, as we have hundreds of stories of him, but one of the most legendary tactics was his night attack of 1462. Here, he was facing Mehmed's triggered army, but Vlad didn't strike during the day, but in the darkness. His men were disguised in Ottoman uniforms and infiltrated the camp at night. Soon enough, chaos was everywhere as the soldiers turned on each other, not knowing who was a friend or a foe. But this was just the start of the horror, because after that, the captured soldiers were mutilated or impaled. This message showed the Ottoman Empire that even their men in their own camp weren't safe. This event was traumatic for Mehmed and his forces. Accounts suggest that thousands of Ottomans were killed not only because of the blades, but by the psychological destruction of waking up to screams, fire, and even the smell of death. Their battle was long and hard, but ultimately, the Ottoman soldiers showed that they were truly skilled. While they never faced an enemy like Vlad, who would be killing his own people and destroying his soldiers, people, and criminals just to display horror, they were able to ultimately win against the guy. Vlad was a master of surprise attacks, but he only conquered the Ottoman army on a much smaller scale. The legend of Dracula. Over time, Vlad's brutality merged with legend as German pamphlets painted him as a blood drinker. A lot of Saxon merchants were exaggerating him cruelly, while the Slavic chronicles called him a tyrant and defender of Christendom. These tales reached the world and fed into the myth of Dracula centuries later. But behind the blood drinker myth, we had an actual ruler who used brutality as state policy. To his enemies, he was a monster worse than anything they had seen, but to his supporters, he was also a savior. The whole stance of whether he was a good guy or bad guy is conflicted to historians, because back in the 15th century, it wasn't just about survival, but it was more of being ready to defend your empire even if the worst tragedy comes. Was he evil? Or was he simply using the only weapon he had against the greatest empire of his age? That's the question we would like to ask you, so comment down below. And if you enjoy darker history, then subscribe to the channel and ring the bell icon to stay updated.